Inside Depth 6 is a first-person horror game featuring a cave explorer documenting strange phenomena in the soon-to-be sealed Purple Lavender mine. Atmosphere. From the very onset, the game makes it clear that you're here to photograph the unnatural, and as you wander through the caves there's a constant feeling of tension as you wait for something to appear. The eerie silence that permeates the game heightens your senses to every little thing, and the slow movement speed only makes a slow trudge through the darkness all the more nail-biting. The game begins very slow, but escalates things quite rapidly as the natural sunlight gives way to the deep dark caves, and the strange events that take place become more sinister the deeper you go. Whilst a lot of the caves look the same, there's no map, compass or signposts, I never found it confusing to explore and never really felt like I was ever truly lost in the caves. Somehow I always made it to the elevator at the end of each section, so maybe it was a little too linear. The greatest addition to the game is the phenomena tracker. It registers unknown forces and does an incredible job of putting the player on edge simply by stating there's something in the area, which it can do without ever needing to present any kind of threat. It's so effective that it can immediately change the atmosphere towards fear and dread, and on the few times it lit up, it froze me in my tracks. There's a great use of sound design to give you the feeling that you're being watched but also toyed with low rumbles to inflict a bit of auditory fear in the player as they go through specific areas, but also mumbles echoing in the distance or the sound of someone clicking their tongue around you with no identifiable source to the sound, which was deeply unsettling. Inside Depth 6 does a lot of things very well, but it has a lack of refinement on certain elements that would have made the experience even better. The enemy animations are rudimentary at best, and many of the running animations are almost comical. Some of the scripted events are just weird and seem sometimes a little silly, but these don't ruin the game. Inside Depth 6 drags out its electrifying tension extremely well. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. Inside Depth 6 is about an hour long, but feels much longer since the agonizing tension sets the player up time and time again for its varied scares. There's a lot of auditory cues, from someone shouting "hey" that pierced the silence and made me freeze on the spot, to the sound of a fly buzzing around my head, which was just unpleasant, but every time the source was impossible to pinpoint. There were so many moments where you feel you aren't alone in the caves but can't see what's with you, to the point where seeing the actual enemies is somehow less frightening. Jump scares are used quite sparsely, but when they are, there's not a great deal of variety. With enemies often appearing out of nowhere and charging at you, or hanged bodies falling from the ceiling, these aren't very original, but despite this, it's hard to say they aren't effective. Using the camera causes the screen to go black for a brief moment, which the game capitalizes on. Dragging out the pause before you can see again as you take pictures of enemies can be absolutely terrifying. There's some nerve-wracking moments like taking a key out of an enemy's hand by holding down a button to stay calm, which feels like you're tempting fate. But there's really one thing the game does best. The phenomena scanner often steals the show, making even a locked door seem terrifying because you just don't know what's going to happen, but is telling you that something is there. It's a classic fear of the unknown trick that's executed very well. The game may never have even needed enemies if they'd utilized this with more sound design tricks. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. There's an eerie silence that fills the caves, followed by slow footsteps of the player, and this is all the ambience you really get. There's some low rumbling as mentioned earlier, but where the game excels is in its sound effects, with a large number of things used to give the player the feeling that they aren't alone, from twigs snapping to people shouting and murmuring in the distance. The reverb is a bit hit and miss, with voices reverberating greatly, but footsteps being somehow immune to the unnatural acoustics of the cave. But where things start to go south is its use of directional audio audio, it's not always clear where things are coming from, and some sound effects seem to deliberately obfuscate this. But it's hard to criticize the directional audio, since even though it doesn't work in certain places, it still manages to cause panic to the player, since the source of the noises can't be pinpointed. There's no voice acting and next to no music, making the game very quiet. Whilst it doesn't need these things to excel, it's worth giving it the point for the sound effects alone. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. There's a literal lake of blood at the end of the game, but somehow it's not shocking or impactful in the slightest, it's just there. The bodies are repeated and a bit generic, and overall, the gore in the game feels either completely out of place or kind of unnecessary. That's 3 Harry Masons still. Story. The only story really provided comes at the start. It's 1976 and you're exploring the Purple Lavender Mine, which many have entered but none have left, and why that is still a mystery in itself. The mine is monitored by the military, but why it's being monitored isn't really explained. There's several notes to pick up that mention the fabled Depth 6, but it's always kind of vague as to what's really going on. Maybe science experiments, maybe rituals. I never found conclusive evidence until I got to the bottom, which left me even more confounded. There's audio cassettes to pick up from a previous explorer, but they aren't very well written and don't explain a great deal either. There's certain events that could be hinting towards your character hallucinating the experience, but even after completing the game, I never really felt like I understood what really happened, and the events that led up to Depth 6 almost seemed random, with so little of it explained. Which makes the final score 3 out of 5 Harry Masons. Whilst the game's experience is pretty damn good, it fails in certain places by trying to add a story that feels both incoherent and kind of unnecessary. Even the title of the game pushes you towards this big final level, but all that's really there is disappointment. But the journey down is far more interesting than its finale. Again, I'd like to remind you the whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst it was more about the things we saw along the way, I didn't scream like a banshee or run away with the computer, and I advise you don't either. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace.